Hi, I'm very pleased to have this invitation to talk to you all about Father Max Joseph Metzger. Probably not a household name. He was murdered by the Nazis back in 1944 because he was doing what he really loved so much, namely trying to promote peace in the world. And he didn't just start in the Nazi period in the 1940s. He also started in the middle of World War I. He was a young Catholic priest in Germany actually at the latter part of the 19th century, and was drawn into World War I, which started in 1914, because he was the equivalent of a chaplain in a particular division of the German army. It was one of the things that he signed up for as a young priest, doing all kinds of apostolic work. He was drawn into the war. It was on the Western Front, not on the Eastern Front. And then it started, of course, in September 1914. In the middle of the spring, the following year, 1915, he was injured badly apparently with gas to some extent, not severely, but sufficiently to get him mustered out of the active army at that point. He immediately then went home in southern Germany, very quickly followed an opportunity to go to Austria, which of course was also in the World War I, the Germans and the Austrians together against the Western allies, England, France, and then Russia. In any case, what he did then in 1915 was to start in Austria, also German speaking, a movement for peace. Talk about taking opportunities right by the throat and going for it. And so here he was in the middle of World War I, having served on the Western Front, having been gassed and mustered out as a result, on starting at that time, a local German-Austrian peace movement, which at the end of the war, he expanded to a worldwide Catholic one. Amazing kind of things. Father Metzger did many, many, many things. He was someone who conceived new ideas and then worked diligently, enthusiastically, 110%, I would put it that way, to realize his many ideas, which included things like anti-alcoholism. Now you might think that's strange. Well, remember in the United States, way back in the 1920s, in the wake of World War I, we launched an anti-alcohol movement nationwide. We even had a modification to the U.S. Congress, not Congress, the U.S. Documents that created the basis for our laws. And we had then the Roaring Twenties and all that went with that. During that period, Father Metzger, among many other things, launched his fundamental anti-alcoholism, pro-vegetarianism, all of which sounds very, very much like a century later. In any case, that was the sort of thing that got him launched in all kinds of activities. And my wife and I found that so fascinating, what little bit we knew about him. We could read about him in more available journals or references in books. So we proceeded to go to Germany and spend the whole summer doing research in the various archives of the different Catholic chancery offices in Freiburg, where he was originally from, Freiburg in southwestern Germany, and in Austria, and followed up on so many of the things that he did, including the founding of a religious order, actually two, one for men and one for women. The one for women, in fact, still exists. They're at Meitingen near Freiburg in Germany, still exists today, very vigorous. The one for men was basically killed by the First World War because the initial men that joined with them eventually were destroyed by the war. But he also was very, very instrumental in launching, as I indicated before, a movement for world peace out of definitely from his Catholic tradition, Christian, not limited, but that was the basis for his connections. That's where he was trained, and he became a very serious interlocutor by writing with two of the popes during the 1920s. So that gives you some indication of how high up, so to speak, his reach went. He did much better with the Pope than he did with his own Archbishop in Freiburg in Germany. Unfortunately, he was saddled with an Archbishop who was very, very conservative in the negative sense. I say in the negative sense because one can be conservatively valuing those traditions from history, which are constitutive of our humanity. And this is a very important kind of effort to engage in. But his Archbishop wasn't conservative in that sense, or at least not in that sense alone. He ended up playing footsie with the Nazis. So that tells you what kind of conservatism he was pushing. And this plagued poor Father Metzger all during his life. In any case, he worked very hard in developing world peace organizations, world Catholic peace organizations. And if you do any research at all on peace movements in their first half of the 20th century, Father Max Josef Metzger's name will come up very prominently. And of course, it was exactly that which got him killed. He did all kinds of things during the Nazi period to resist, but of course, one had to thread the needle very carefully, otherwise you just were dead in a hurry. One of the major things that he did in this period under the domination of Nazism in Germany and quickly all of Europe when the war started, launched by Hitler in 1938, attacking Poland. One of the things that became very prominent and that to this very day has a very profound influence on you and me. Namely, he promoted a movement which had started already in a very quiet way among a small number of Catholic and Protestant scholars who one of the really important things important in the sense that it has very, very profound effect to this day is his strong support and organization abilities in what became the movement for dialogue among Christians of different churches and among religions and ideologies in general. That all, of course, came to fruition after his death. It came to fruition in a major kind of way in the Second Vatican Council of the Roman Catholic Church, going from 1962 to 64, which revolutionized the attitude and action of the Catholic Church and its, well, now I guess something like 1.4 billion, that's with a B, Catholics around the world. If you could put those Catholics in dialogue with other religions, especially thinking in terms of numbers, in dialogue with Islam, which probably is something like 1.6 billion in the world, you would be covering over a third of the 7.2 billion people in the world alive today, the human beings. And that is a huge force. So what little bit I want to say about what Father Max Metzger did back then had immense, massive kinds of impact down to the very day, because the kind of work he was doing then, I will say something about it in a moment, was essential for the effective launching of the Second Vatican Council, which transformed to this very day the Catholic Church, and as I said, the 1.3 billion Catholics today, and all those that they engage in dialogue with. And you think to yourself, well, how could one priest in one place who got killed, by the way, before he was able to really do anything publicly very dramatic, have such an effect? Well, that's in fact what happened. And he picked up on what started as a very quiet movement among Catholic and Protestant thinkers in Germany at the end of World War I. So in the very early 1920s, a very small number of Catholic, mainly thinkers, scholars, and Protestant thinkers and scholars in Germany began to write together and began to say to themselves, what we need to do is we need to overcome the horrible break and destruction of communication among Christians, especially among Christians in the West, where they could do something about it. They were thinking and writing in German, of course. And so they then launched, in a very quiet, scholarly sort of way, the beginnings of a dialogue between Catholics and Protestants. This was started in the early 1920s. It was vociferously condemned by the Vatican, by the Pope, again and again and again, until it flipped and went in a positive direction. So Father Metzger wasn't really particularly involved in it organization-wise in the 1920s, but mentally and theologically, that was his life, one of building bridges between people on all kinds of issues, including alcoholism, vegetarianism, world peace, etc., and Catholics and Protestants being in serious dialogue with each other. Now, you might think today, oh, well, that's not such a big deal. Well, I want to remind you, back up, say, 20 years ago from now, and ask yourself, what were Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland doing? They were shooting each other constantly because they were Catholic or because they were Protestant. this sort of thing it has gone out of the consciousness of American Christians, Catholic or Protestant. We had a lot of hatred, and we still do have a lot of hatred, of course. But at least for the most part, we weren't shooting each other because, well, I was going to say because we're Christian. And now, unfortunately, we are shooting each other for all kinds of reasons. And so that's another area where we need the sort of people like Father Max Metzger. In any case, to come back to it, Father Max was doing, especially in the early 1930s. Remember, Hitler came to power in Germany in January 1933. And very quickly, within 2 months, he had the powers, the levers of all power in Germany. And potential opposition was quickly put in jail and just plain murdered. Metzger was able to, at that point, go between Scylla and Charybdis and not crash on either side. He was very careful in pursuing his work, because if he was killed, then of course the work he was doing would not further, but the opposite. In any case, what he did was he was able to, as it were, grab the influence of this growing dialogue between German Protestant Catholic scholars in the early 1920s, after having been condemned by the papacy time and time and time again by all subsequent popes, all three of them in that period, from the 19 teens to the late 1950s. And during that time, Father Metzger nevertheless was able to thread the needle as far as the papacy is concerned in this work. And what was launched by the early 1930s, that Metzger was able to really shepherd and encourage and bring together. Remember now, this is all under the eyes and intrusion of the Gestapo everywhere. Everything had to be done carefully, secretly, coded names, all the kind of stuff that whodunit books are full of these days. In any case, he started this circle, or he pulled it into existence as a movement rather than just isolated discussions here, there, and elsewhere. And the term that they used to describe themselves were two Latin words from the creed. And on Sunday morning, not just Catholics and Orthodox, but and Anglicans, and I would say also all the high church, so-called high church like Lutheranism and so on Sunday mornings will recite the creed. I believe in da, 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 da. And it ended, I believe in credo, in unum Deum sanctum catholicam, in one holy Catholic Apostolic Church. And so he then picked up on this phrase, I believe in one holy, unum sanctam in Latin. And so this movement was known as the Una Sancta movement, the one holy. And so it was German Catholics and Protestants meeting, mainly intellectuals, theologians, and related, basically intellectuals, those who were deep readers, who were the directors of society. And yep. What happened is that my wife, Arlene Anderson Swidler, who was a fantastic scholar in her own right, and with whom I worked together on many projects, including the writing, the research for, and the writing of life of Father Max Josef Metzger, the founder, I would say, of this Una Sancta movement. Una Sancta, one and holy, in Latin, two Latin words from the traditional creed in the Catholic Church, going back to the 4th century, the 300s and to 500, the various ecumenical councils then, producing this creed, I believe in one holy. And so those first scholars who in Germany were beginning to dialogue with each other, regardless of what their superiors on both sides were saying, that they should do that. They did, and especially under the pressure of Nazism. Remember, the Nazis came to power early 1933 and immediately began throwing people in jail and worse, killing them. And so these Una Sancta meetings and groups in various cities all around Germany began to meet, basically not exactly in secret, but on the quiet. Did not broadcast it, just spread the word of the meeting by word of mouth. Metzger was then the overall coordinator, gave it a kind of unity, and he physically visited all of these towns and cities in Germany during this critical period in the 30s, with Gestapo breathing down his neck all this time. And among other things, he was then promoting the knitting together of these newly emerging Una Sancta organizations or groups, Catholic and Protestant dialogue groups. Also, really sub rosa, he was also doing what he could in the trip around Germany to help foster the Underground Railroad for sneaking Jews out of Nazi Germany, which of course was really deadly. And so eventually, unfortunately, in his efforts to build peace between, at that point, Germany and the Allied forces, he sent a proposal that he wanted to have submitted to the Catholic and Anglican bishops in England, and proposing a peace settlement, at least to get a way to get it started, and all of which, of course, was in the spirit of his peace organizations, which he has started, as I mentioned already, way back in the middle of World War I, when he was mustered out because of his physical injuries out of the German army. Well, in Nazi Germany, he was promoting that sub rosa, of course. And unfortunately, the Gestapo caught a hint of it, and he was trapped, sent to jail, spent several months in jail, from which we have his so-called letters from jail, which have been published in German. If some young scholar wants to do something, that would be a good idea for him or her to undertake the process of translating and explaining them into English. In any case, the Nazis caught him, sent him to jail, and he was there for several months. And in the end, in 1944, he was beheaded by the Nazis. And at the end of the war, because of his notoriety among those leaders of this Una Sancta movement, his leadership, his thought, his teaching, and his writings eventually became known very much wider, and had a great deal to do with the launch of the Second Vatican Council. What was the heart of the Second Vatican Council? It's when Pope John the 23rd decided that he wanted to have a council which was going to bridge the gap in dialogue between Jews and Christians and Catholics, Protestants, and others. This was the heart of what Vatican II was all about. And that is exactly what Father Metzger was doing. And you can see the line of force from the efforts of the predecessors at the end of World War I, Catholic and Protestant German thinkers, and creating eventually the Una Sancta movement, which exploded within Germany, exploded in a positive sense, under the pressure cooker of Nazi oppression and Gestapo, which eventually killed Metzger. But as the old saying, the blood of martyrs is the source of reality, the new church growing. And that's what happened at the end of World War II. Then a new pope came in, Pope John the 23rd, I should say, Pope Saint John the 23rd. He's been subsequently canonized. And he was able to take the work of Metzger and those that he was working with and bring it from the local or the national level of Germany to the world, to today, right here in the United States, in the new century, new millennium, 2000 plus. As I mentioned briefly, years ago, my wife Arlene and I went to Germany and spent much of the summer going from Chancery office to Chancery office in Germany and in Austria, and visiting people, interviewing people who knew, worked with Father Max Metzger, and together we produced this biography of Father Max Metzger. And now with the additional help, we're able to bring this biography of the work of Father Max Metzger, his peace work and his dialogue work, is brought up to date because we have, as a result of the additional research of what happened after Metzger's death and the end of the war, further expansion of the Una Sancta circles, which then fed into the creation of the Second Vatican Council, which transformed not only Catholicism and its 1.3 billion, but it transformed the world, because now for over a half a century, we have the Catholic Church in all of its apparatus, which not always in the past has been used for good, has been used and will be used continuing into the future to build bridges of dialogue and collaboration. It is helping to transform the world. And the contribution of one man, Father Max Josef Metzger, was fundamental in making that happen to this very day. I also want to say a special word of gratitude to Dr. McDuffie, Cormac McDuffie. My goodness, how Irish sounding can you get? And all of the fantastic work he's done in lifting up new material on Father Metzger and the Una Sancta movement as it grew after Metzger's death, and to a very significant extent because of Metzger's death. I might also mention that there's this kind of a family connection with Dr. McDuffie. I want to say a special word of deep gratitude to Dr. Cormac McDuffie for all the work he's done and the contribution to what he has written up for this book about Father Metzger, especially the material after his death. It really brings it up to date, which is extremely helpful. Also, there is a personal connection on my mother's side of the family. My grandmother's name was Duffy, which of course fits here. And so we Duffys have to stick together in our work.